72 notices. That's what it took for a supposedly pristine neighborhood association to decide a folded piece of nylon was worth $25,000 in fines. People think power lives in Washington or Wall Street. It doesn't. It lives in beige subdivision clubhouses, wielded by retirees with clipboards and too much free time. They thought they could bleed a retired combat medic dry over a flag. They were wrong. Here is how they ended up paying rent to the man they tried to evict. Moving boxes were still stacked in the living room when the first letter arrived. Oak Ridge Estates was supposed to be a sanctuary after 20 years patching up shattered kids in desert outposts. Peace and quiet were the only metrics that mattered to me. The neighborhood was a sprawling grid of manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and houses painted in various shades of oatmeal. It lacked character, but it promised silence. I bought the house at the end of a cul-de-sac, signed the massive stack of closing documents, and handed over a down payment built from 2 decades of hazard pay. The first thing I did after unloading the truck was hang the flag. It wasn't a massive, obnoxious banner. It was a standard 3x5 American flag, flown on a simple wooden pole bracketed to the front porch pillar. The fabric was slightly faded, the edges bearing the microscopic phrase of wind and time. It had flown over a medical tent in Kandahar. To me, it wasn't a political statement or a territorial marker. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the people who hadn't made it back to buy a house in a quiet subdivision. 3 days later, I found the envelope taped to my front door. It was a heavy stock, cream-colored envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore the letterhead of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Dear resident, welcome to the community. Please note that under Section 4, Paragraph B of the Architectural Guidelines, exterior displays are strictly regulated to maintain the aesthetic harmony of Oak Ridge Estates. Your current display, flag banner, exceeds the permitted dimensions of 18 (24 inches) and utilizes an unauthorized mounting bracket. Please remove the display within 48 hours to avoid a non-compliance fee of 50 HOA. Sincerely, Blanca Young, President, HOA. I read the letter twice, standing on the porch. I looked at the flag, shifting lazily in the afternoon breeze. Then I looked down the street. Every house was a mirror image of the next. No garden gnomes, no wind chimes, no individuality, just a sterile, unbroken line of suburban conformity. I folded the letter, tossed it into the recycling bin under the kitchen sink, and went back to unpacking. I assumed it was a bureaucratic glitch, a form letter sent out by an overzealous neighborhood watch. I had dealt with military bureaucracy for half my life. I knew how to ignore pointless paperwork. That was my first mistake. By Friday, a second envelope was taped to the door. This one was accompanied by a photograph. Someone had stood at the end of my driveway, zoomed in on the porch, and taken a picture of the flag. A red circle had been digitally drawn around the mounting bracket. The fine was now $100. The letter stated that fines would compound daily if the unauthorized modification was not rectified. Monday morning, I decided to handle it face-to-face. I drove down to the community entrance. The HOA didn't have a clubhouse inside the neighborhood. A few years prior, a black mold infestation had condemned the original community center. Instead, the association rented a corner suite in a commercial strip mall directly adjacent to the subdivision gates. The office smelled like floor wax and stale vanilla air freshener. A massive aerial map of Oak Ridge Estates dominated the back wall. Sitting behind a faux mahogany desk was a woman who looked like she had been born wearing a sensible beige cardigan. "Can I help you?" she asked, not looking up from her monitor. I'm looking for Blanca Young." She finally looked up, her eyes dropping to my boots, scanning up my jeans and plain black t-shirt, before settling on my face. Her lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. "I am Blanca. You must be Mr. Martin. 42 Maple Court." "That's right, I'm here about these letters." I placed the 2 envelopes on her desk. Blanca didn't touch them. She steepled her fingers. "The rules are quite clear, Mr. Martin. We pride ourselves on the uniformity of Oak Ridge Estates. It's what keeps our property values high. Once we allow one unapproved flag, suddenly people are putting up inflatable snowmen in July and painting their doors neon green. It's an American flag, Blanca, not a neon door. The subject of the display is irrelevant, she said smoothly, leaning back in her ergonomic chair. The dimensions and the hardware are in violation. Take it down, pay the 100 fee in accrued fines, submit an architectural review request for a AOT non-inch garden flag, and we can put this behind us. Her tone wasn't hostile, it was worse. It was the condescending, unyielding tone of a mid-level administrator who had finally found a domain to rule. I'm not taking it down, I said quietly. Blanca's eyes narrowed. The veneer of neighborly concern vanished, replaced by a cold, bureaucratic gleam. She reached out, sliding the letters back toward me with one manicured finger. Then the fines will compound, Mr. Martin. Every 24 hours. We have a very aggressive collection agency. Welcome to the neighborhood. Summer bled into autumn, and the beige dictatorship tightened its grip. Every morning, like clockwork, the mail carrier delivered a certified letter. Every morning I tossed it onto a growing stack on my kitchen island. The numbers stopped being an annoyance and started becoming a threat. The HOA covenants were written with a brutal, compounding mathematics designed to break resistance. $50 became $100. $100 became $250. After 30 days of non-compliance, the daily penalty skyrocketed. They added administrative fees, legal review costs, and community disruption surcharges. By October, the stack of letters was 3 inches thick. The total balance owed sat at $8,105. I was stubborn, but I wasn't stupid. I knew I couldn't just ignore it forever. I hired a local attorney for a consultation, dropping $300 just to have a guy in a cheap suit look at the HOA bylaws. We sat in his cramped office downtown. He flipped through the thick binder of Oak Ridge covenants, chewing on the end of a plastic pen. Alden, I'm going to shoot straight with you, the lawyer said, closing the binder with a heavy thud. These bylaws are ironclad. When you signed your closing documents, you signed away a terrifying amount of property rights. They have a legal mandate to enforce these aesthetic guidelines. Oof, it's a flag, I countered, the frustration leaking into my voice. It's protected speech. Not on private property governed by a contract you voluntarily signed. The First Amendment protects you from the government, not from Blanca Young and the Oak Ridge Board of Directors. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Right now, they are fining you. If you hit $10,000, the covenants grant them the right to place a lien on your house. If you don't pay the lien, they can initiate foreclosure proceedings. They can steal my house over a piece of cloth. They can legally seize the asset to satisfy the debt. Yes. He sighed, looking at me with a mix of pity and exhaustion. Just take the bracket down, Alden. Pay a negotiated settlement. I can probably get Blanca to knock the fines down to a couple of grand if you comply today. Fight this, and you will lose your home. I drove back to Oak Ridge in silence. The neighborhood looked different to me now. The pristine lawns didn't look peaceful. They looked like a hostage situation. I watched a neighbor meticulously trimming his hedges with a pair of hand shears, making sure not a single leaf or no crossed the property line. Fear. That's what kept the grass so short. That night, the community board was holding its monthly open forum. I decided to make one last attempt to appeal to the human beings behind the paperwork. The meeting was held in the same strip mall office. About 20 folding chairs were arranged in rows, facing a long folding table. 5 board members sat behind the table. Blanca was dead center, a microphone positioned in front of her. I took a seat in the back. A few neighbors glanced at me, their eyes darting away the moment I made eye contact. I was the pariah, the rule breaker, the guy risking the sanctity of their property values. For an hour, I sat through excruciating debates about the approved shade of taupe for exterior trim and complaints about a dog barking on Elm Street. Finally, Blanca announced the open comment period. You had 3 minutes. I stood up and walked to the podium. Alden Martin, 42 Maple Court. I kept my voice level. I'm here to request a variance for the flag on my porch. It's a standard size. It causes no structural damage. It obstructs no one's view. It has deep personal significance, and I am asking the board to exercise common sense and waive these compounding fines." Blanca didn't even look at me. She stared at a ledger in front of her. "Mr. Martin, as you have been informed repeatedly, variances must be submitted in writing prior to installation. You bypassed the architectural committee. To grant you a variance now would set a dangerous precedent of lawlessness in this community." "Lawlessness?" I laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "It's a bracket and a flag, Blanca. Not a meth lab." "Your 3 minutes are up, Mr. Martin," she said, tapping her gavel lightly on the table. "I'm not finished." "Security," Blanca said, her voice dripping with board authority. An off-duty local cop hired for $40 an hour to stand by the door took a step toward me. He looked apologetic, but his hand rested near his belt. "Come on, buddy. Don't make it a thing." I looked at the 5 board members. Not one of them met my gaze. They stared at their notes, their phones, the ceiling tiles. They were entirely comfortable letting Blanca play the tyrant, so long as their own beige walls remained untouched. I stepped away from the podium and walked out into the cool night air. By December, the fines hit $25,000. The letter that arrived 3 days before Christmas wasn't from the HOA. It was from a law firm representing the HOA. It was a formal notice of a lien placed on my property. The letter gave me 30 days to remit $25,000 in a certified cashier's check, plus $3,500 in legal fees, or foreclosure proceedings would commence. They were going to take the house. I had survived mortar fire. I had survived IEDs. I had survived things Blanca Young couldn't comprehend in her darkest nightmares, and I was going to lose my sanctuary to a woman armed with a clipboard and a zoning code. I sat at my kitchen island in the dark, a glass of cheap whiskey in my hand, staring at the legal notice. In the military, when you are outgunned and outmaneuvered, you don't keep charging the machine gun nest. You retreat, you analyze the terrain, and you find the enemy's structural weakness. You don't fight them where they are strong. You fight them where they aren't looking. I pulled out my laptop and started digging. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA was a fortress on paper, but every fortress has a supply line. I stopped looking at the bylaws and started looking at the business entity. I spent 4 sleepless nights navigating state corporate registries, public property records, and commercial zoning databases. The HOA was registered as a nonprofit corporation. I downloaded their annual public financial disclosures. They had a healthy reserve fund, mostly generated by bleeding residents dry over minor infractions. But their operating costs were surprisingly high. The biggest line item, aside from landscaping and legal retainers, was rent. Because the original clubhouse had been condemned and demolished years ago, the HOA leased Suite 104 in the Oak Ridge Plaza strip mall. They paid $4,200 a month for the privilege of a corner office, a conference room, and a storage area for their endless archives of complaint forms. I looked up the property records for Oak Ridge Plaza. The strip mall was owned by a holding company called Apex Commercial Properties. A quick search revealed that Apex was bleeding out. They had defaulted on a major loan for a different development across the state and were actively liquidating underperforming assets to cover their debt. Oak Ridge Plaza was an underperforming asset. It had 3 vacant storefronts, a struggling dry cleaner, a mediocre pizza place, and the HOA office. The building wasn't officially listed on the open market, but in the commercial real estate world, a distressed owner is a beacon. I needed a professional. I needed a shark who knew the local waters. I found Thorin Wright through a veteran networking group. Thorin had done 2 tours in Ramadi before coming home and getting his real estate broker's license. He specialized in commercial acquisitions. He was a guy who understood that business was just warfare in a tailored suit. We met at a diner a few miles outside the neighborhood. I slid a manila folder across the sticky laminate table. "I need to buy a building," I said. Thorin opened the folder, scanning the printouts of the property records and the Apex financial summaries. He took a bite of his eggs, chewing slowly. "Oak Ridge Plaza," Thorin muttered. "Ugly brick box. Roof probably needs replacing in 5 years. Parking lot is a mess of potholes. Why do you want this dog?" "Revenge," I said flatly. Thorin stopped chewing. He looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't smile, but a glint of genuine interest sparked in his gaze. Explain. I told him the whole story. The flag, the bracket, the letters, the escalating fines, the $25,000 lien on my house, the impending foreclosure. I explained how Blanca Young had weaponized the covenants to build a fiefdom, and how the entire neighborhood was too paralyzed by fear of property devaluation to stand up to her. They hold a lien on my house, I finished. They think they own me, but if I buy that strip mall, I own their office. I become their landlord. Thorin whistled low and soft. He closed the folder. Buying a commercial property isn't like buying a house, Alden. You're looking at a multi-million-dollar valuation, even for a distressed property like this. You have that kind of capital? I have my military pension, I have disability, and I have a sizable investment portfolio from 20 years of never spending a dime while deployed, but I'll need a commercial loan to cover the bulk of it. With a $25,000 lien currently sitting on your primary residence? Thorin shook his head. No traditional bank is going to underwrite a commercial mortgage for you with an active HOA lien threatening your collateral. The wind went out of my sails. The whiskey-fueled master plan was crashing into the cold wall of financial reality. So it's a dead end. I didn't say that. Thorin leaned forward, lowering his voice. I said a traditional bank won't touch it, but Apex is desperate. They don't have time to wait for a buyer to secure traditional financing and go through a 90-day closing period. They need liquidity yesterday to stave off bankruptcy. What are you suggesting? Seller financing, Thorin said, tapping the folder. We approach Apex directly. We offer them a rapid close, 15 days. We put down a massive cash down payment, enough to solve their immediate liquidity crisis. In exchange, they hold the note for the remainder of the purchase price. We bypass the banks entirely. The HOA lien on your house won't matter to Apex because the commercial building itself is the collateral for the loan. I did the math in my head. It would require liquidating almost every asset I had. My retirement accounts, my mutual funds, the emergency cash I kept in a high-yield savings account. I would be putting my entire financial future on the line just to buy a rundown strip mall, to get back at a petty tyrant. It was reckless. It was objectively insane. How much cash do we need to make them bite? I asked. Thorin smiled. It was a predatory, joyful expression. Let me make some calls. Start liquidating your stocks, Alden. We're going hunting. The next 2 weeks were a blur of wire transfers, legal documents, and mounting anxiety. Thorin was relentless. He bypassed the brokers and got directly on the phone with the CEO of Apex. He played the situation perfectly, offering a lifeline to a drowning man, but demanding brutal terms in return. Apex agreed to a purchase price of $1.2 million. I had to wire $400,000 in cash, everything I had to my name, to the escrow account. Apex would finance the remaining $800,000 at a steep interest rate. But it didn't matter. I wasn't buying the building to hold it for 30 years. I was buying it for leverage. While the paperwork was processing, the clock on my house was ticking down. The 30-day notice on the lien was expiring. The HOA's lawyers sent a final warning. Pay the $2,500 fees had grown by the 15th of January, or the foreclosure filing would hit the county courthouse. On January 12th at 4 p.m., Thorin called me. Deed is recorded, he said. Congratulations, Alden. You are the proud owner of Oak Ridge Plaza. I sat in my living room, staring out the window at the beige houses across the street. The heavy weight that had been sitting on my chest for 6 months vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. Send me the HOA's lease agreement, I said. 10 minutes later, the PDF hit my inbox. I printed it out and spread the pages across my kitchen island. I poured a cup of black coffee and read every single word of the 30-page commercial lease that Blanca Young had signed 3 years ago on behalf of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Blanca was a master of residential covenants, but she was an amateur at commercial real estate. She had signed a standard boilerplate landlord-friendly lease. I flipped to Section 12, Use of Premises and Rules of Conduct. There it was, the fatal flaw. A standard clause giving the landlord absolute discretion to regulate exterior signage, aesthetic modifications, and structural additions to the leased premises. Furthermore, Section 14 outlined the landlord's right to enter the premises for inspections, and Section 22 detailed the eviction protocols for non-compliance with landlord directives. She had weaponized the fine print against me. Now I held the pen. I spent the rest of the evening drafting a letter. I didn't use a lawyer. I didn't need one. I used the exact same formatting, the exact same bureaucratic tone, and the exact same heavy-stock cream paper she had used against me. The next morning, January 13th, I put on a suit. I hadn't worn a suit since I left the service. It felt like armor. I drove down to the strip mall. The parking lot was empty save for Blanca's immaculate white Lexus, parked directly in front of the HOA office. I walked up to the glass door. Stenciled in gold lettering were the words, Oak Ridge Estates, HOA, Management Office. I pushed the door open. The bell chimed. Blanca was sitting at her desk, typing furiously. She looked up, the familiar scowl immediately forming on her face. "Mr. Martin," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "If you are here to plead your case, you are too late. The payment deadline is in 2 days. Our attorneys have already drafted the foreclosure filings." I didn't say a word. I walked across the room, my dress shoes clicking loudly against the cheap laminate flooring. I reached her desk and placed a single cream-colored envelope directly in the center of her keyboard. Blanca stared at it, confused. "What is this? If this isn't a cashier's check for $28,500, I have nothing to discuss with you." "Open it," I said softly. She rolled her eyes, picked up the envelope, and sliced it open with a brass letter opener. She pulled out the single sheet of paper. I watched her eyes scan the text. I watched the progression of emotions play out across her face. First, annoyance. Then, confusion. Then, a sudden, horrifying realization. "Dear tenant, welcome to the new management. Please note that under Section 12 of your commercial lease agreement, exterior displays, signage, and aesthetic modifications are strictly regulated to maintain the harmony of Oak Ridge Plaza. Your current display, gold stenciled window lettering and unauthorized door signage, exceeds the newly established zero-tolerance policy for exterior modifications. Furthermore, as the new property owner, I will be conducting a full structural and aesthetic inspection of Suite 104 at 8:00 a.m. tomorrow. Please remove all unauthorized signage within 24 hours to avoid a commercial non-compliance fee of $5,000, compounding daily. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination of the lease and lockout proceedings. Sincerely, Alden Martin, owner, Oak Ridge Plaza." Blanca looked up from the paper. The blood had entirely drained from her face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The beige dictator was suddenly, violently, out of her depth. "You," she finally choked out, the paper trembling in her hand. "You bought the building." "I did," I said, leaning over her desk, placing both hands flat on the faux mahogany. "And Blanca, I am a very strict landlord." Tuesday morning arrived with a biting frost that coated the strip mall parking lot in a thin layer of dirty ice. At precisely 7:55 a.m., I parked my truck next to Blanca's immaculate Lexus. I wasn't alone. I had hired an independent commercial building inspector named Harrison. Harrison was a retired fire marshal who carried his clipboard like a broadsword and possessed a terrifying, encyclopedic knowledge of municipal building codes. We walked into Suite 104 at exactly 8 o'clock. Blanca wasn't alone either. Sitting beside her desk, looking deeply annoyed at being awake this early, was a man in a sharp charcoal suit who reeked of expensive cologne and billed-by-the-hour confidence. This was David Caldwell, the HOA's retained legal counsel. "Mr. Martin," Caldwell said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "We need to have a conversation about this harassment. You are weaponizing a real estate transaction to circumvent a legally binding residential lien. A judge will see right through this retaliatory behavior." "It's not harassment, David," I said, handing him a clean copy of the commercial lease agreement Blanca had signed 3 years prior. "It's a routine landlord inspection. Section 14 clearly outlines my right to inspect the premises for structural integrity and code compliance. You were given adequate written notice. Now please step aside so my inspector can do his job." Caldwell frowned, scanning the lease. He was a residential real estate attorney, used to bullying homeowners who didn't know their rights. Commercial real estate was an entirely different battlefield, governed by ruthless contracts, where consumer protections rarely applied. "Proceed," Caldwell muttered to Blanca. "Let him do his little walkthrough. Then we proceed with the foreclosure filing on his house tomorrow." Blanca crossed her arms, a smug, triumphant smile returning to her face. She thought this was a bluff. She thought I was just trying to scare her. "Harrison," I said, nodding to the inspector, "take your time." For the next 2 hours, Harrison dismantled their office. He didn't use hyperbole or threats. He used a tape measure, a digital thermometer, and a voltage tester. He was a machine methodically hunting for every microscopic violation in a commercial space that hadn't been properly maintained in a decade. "Filing cabinets blocking the secondary egress route," Harrison noted, his pen scratching loudly across his clipboard. "That's a severe fire code violation. The kitchenette coffee maker is plugged into a non-GFCI outlet near a water source. Electrical hazard. The accent wall behind the receptionist's desk is painted Navajo white. The lease strictly specifies commercial standard eggshell for all interior walls. Unauthorized modification." Blanca scoffed. "You're citing me for an off-white wall? That's ridiculous." "No, Blanca," I replied, pulling a notepad from my jacket. "I'm citing you for an unauthorized aesthetic modification, just like an unauthorized flag bracket." I walked over to the front windows. The gold stenciled lettering advertising the HOA management office was still there. "The unapproved signage remains on the glass," I noted, writing it down. "That's a failure to cure a direct lease violation within the 24-hour notice period. Section 12 penalty applies." By the time Harrison finished checking the drop ceiling for unpermitted wiring, Caldwell was pacing the floor, his face flushed. Blanca was sitting rigidly at her desk, the smugness completely drained from her features. "Let's tally it up," I said, resting my hands on Blanca's desk. $5,000 for the unapproved window signage, compounded over 2 days. That's 10 grand. $2,000 for the blocked egress route. $1,500 for the electrical violations, and $500 for the unauthorized paint job. I pulled a pre-printed commercial invoice from my folder, filled in the numbers, and slid it across the desk to her. $14,000, I stated, payable to Apex Commercial Properties, my holding company, within 10 business days. If payment is not received, daily late fees of 5% will accrue, and I will initiate commercial eviction proceedings. We are a non-profit neighborhood association. Blanca practically shrieked, her hands trembling as she looked at the invoice. We don't have $14,000 allocated for commercial lease penalties in our operating budget. Then you better hold a bake sale, I said quietly, or levy a special assessment on the neighborhood. I'm sure the residents of Oak Ridge Estates will love paying out of pocket because their board president couldn't follow a simple lease agreement. Caldwell stepped forward, slamming his hand down on the desk. You can't do this, Martin. This is extortion. Extortion is illegal, David. This is capitalism. This is the enforcement of a legally binding contract that your client voluntarily signed. I leaned in close to Caldwell. You guys love covenants and bylaws when you're using them to steal a veteran's house over a piece of nylon. But the second the rules apply to you, it's extortion. Welcome to commercial real estate. I turned my back on them and walked out the door, Harrison trailing quietly behind me. The bell on the glass door chimed a cheerful goodbye. News travels fast in a subdivision where everyone is terrified of their neighbors. I didn't utter a word to anyone on my street, but within 48 hours, the neighborhood was practically vibrating with gossip. Someone had seen me at the strip mall with the inspector. Caldwell's panicked phone calls to the other HOA board members had leaked. The realization that the neighborhood pariah was suddenly the neighborhood association's landlord sent a shockwave through the oatmeal-colored houses of Oak Ridge Estates. Thursday evening, my doorbell fuck. I checked the porch camera. It wasn't Blanca. It was 2 men I vaguely recognized from the disastrous board meeting months ago. One was a retired accountant named Greg, and the other was a middle manager in his 40s named Paul. They were both voting members of the HOA board. I opened the door, leaning against the frame, making no move to invite them inside. "Alden," Greg started, offering a weak, nervous smile. "We were hoping we could have a reasonable conversation, neighbor to neighbor." "My neighbors are currently trying to foreclose on my home over a flag," I replied, my voice devoid of warmth, "so you'll have to excuse me if I'm not feeling particularly neighborly." Paul cleared his throat, shifting his weight awkwardly on the concrete porch. "Look, Alden, things have gotten out of hand. Blanca is very passionate about the aesthetic standards, but the board just had an emergency closed-door session. This commercial fine you levied against the office, it's catastrophic." $14,000 growing daily, I reminded them. "Right," Greg sighed, running a hand over his balding head. "We reviewed the finances with David Caldwell. If we pay your commercial fines, it drains our emergency reserve fund completely. If we don't pay, Caldwell says you actually have the legal right to lock us out of the office and seize our assets to satisfy the debt. Filing cabinets, computers, historical records of every property dispute for the last 20 years, I listed casually. I'll auction them off in the parking lot." "Alden, please," Paul pleaded, his professional demeanor cracking. "If the HOA goes bankrupt or if we get evicted, the community's insurance premiums skyrocket. Property values will plummet. It will be chaos." "It's fascinating," I said, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawns glowing under the streetlights. For 6 months, I begged this board to exercise basic human decency. I explained that an American flag on a standard bracket hurt no one. None of you cared. You let Blanca hide behind the rules to bleed me dry. You let her put a $28,000 lien on my home. You didn't care about my property values. You didn't care about my bankruptcy. I stepped out onto the porch, towering over them slightly. They instinctively took a half step back. "You only care now because the gun is pointed at your heads," I said. "You only care because it's your budget, your office, and your reputation on the line." Greg looked down at his shoes. He knew I was right. Cowardice was the currency of Oak Ridge Estates, and they had spent it all backing a tyrant. What do you want?" Paul asked quietly. "I want the lien on my house dissolved," I said. "Immediately. I want the $28,000 in residential fines permanently waived, expunged from the neighborhood ledger, and legally nullified in writing." "Done," Greg said instantly. "We have a quorum here. We can authorize Caldwell to release the lien tomorrow morning." "I'm not finished," I said, holding up a hand. I turned and pointed to the wooden pillar on my porch. The flag was still there, hanging motionless in the cold night air. "I want a permanent, irrevocable variance added to the master deed of this specific property. It will explicitly state that Alden Martin has the absolute, unchallengeable right to fly the United States flag on this porch using whatever hardware he deems necessary in perpetuity." Paul swallowed hard. "Blanca will fight that. She considers the architectural guidelines to be sacred. She'll say it sets a precedent. Then she can explain to the entire neighborhood why she bankrupted the HOA over an 18-inch piece of wood," I countered. "I hold the commercial lease. If the lien isn't gone and the variance isn't signed by noon tomorrow, I lock the doors to Suite 104 at exactly 12:01 p.m. And then I send a letter to every single resident in this subdivision explaining exactly why their HOA dues are about to triple to cover my commercial legal fees." I stared them down. The cold wind whipped past us, rattling the flag on its pole. "You have until noon," I said, stepping back inside and shutting the heavy wooden door in their faces. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared at the thick stack of cream-colored envelopes still sitting on the island. The war wasn't over. Blanca wouldn't surrender easily. She was too entrenched in her own authority, too addicted to the tiny sliver of power she held over this beige kingdom. But I had breached the walls. I had cut off her supply and The next morning I didn't go to the strip mall. I didn't put on a suit. I sat in my living room, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans, drinking coffee and watching the clock on the wall tick toward 12. At 11:15 a.m., my phone vibrated. It was an email from David Caldwell. Subject: Martin, OEHOA Settlement Agreement. Attached was a 10-page PDF. I opened it and read through the legal jargon. It was all there: a formal release of the lien on 42 Maple Court, a complete waiver of all outstanding fines, administrative fees, and legal costs, and buried on page 7, an addendum to the master deed, granting a permanent, irrevocable variance for exterior flag display at my address. They had caved. Greg and Paul had clearly staged a mutiny. Faced with total financial ruin, the board had finally developed a spine and overruled their dictator. I scrolled to the signature page. Greg had signed as vice president. Paul had signed as treasurer. Blanca's signature line was completely blank. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The board had forced the settlement, but Blanca was refusing to formally concede. She was holding on to her pride, refusing to put her name on the document that admitted defeat to the man who broke her rules. It didn't matter legally. The signatures of the VP and treasurer constituted a binding majority under their own bylaws. My house was safe. The flag was safe. I had won. But as I looked at that blank signature line, I realized something important. In the military, leaving an enemy commander with their pride intact is a dangerous tactical error. An enemy who believes they were merely outmaneuvered rather than broken will eventually regroup and attack again. Blanca Young was still the president of the HOA. She still wielded power over hundreds of terrified homeowners. Winning my own battle wasn't enough. I needed to finish the war. I picked up my phone and dialed Thorin Wright, my commercial broker. "Thorin," I said when he answered. "The HOA surrendered. They released the lien on the house." "Beautiful," Thorin laughed, the sound booming through the speaker. "I told you seller financing was the magic bullet. You want me to list the strip mall next week? We can probably flip it to a developer and get your cash back with a decent return." "No," I said, looking out the window at the endless rows of identical houses. "We aren't selling the building. We're keeping it." "Keeping it? Alden, you're a retired medic, not a commercial property manager. What are you going to do with a dying strip mall in the suburbs?" "I'm going to become a very active landlord," I replied. "Draft an official commercial eviction notice for Suite 104, failure to pay penalties. I want them out by the end of the month." Thorin went silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was filled with a mixture of awe and concern. "Alden, they gave you what you wanted. They surrendered." "They surrendered to save themselves," I corrected him. "But Blanca is still in charge. She'll just find someone else to terrorize. A young family with a swing set, a widow with unapproved rose bushes. I bought the building to get leverage, but now I own the ground she stands on." "So you're actually going to evict the homeowners association?" "Yes," I said, my voice hardening. "And when I lock the doors, I'm going to put a massive sign in the window. I'm going to invite every resident of Oak Ridge Estates to a town hall meeting in the empty storefront next door. It's time to show this neighborhood exactly how much power they actually have when they stop being afraid of cream-colored envelopes." I hung up the phone and walked out onto the front porch. The sun was breaking through the winter clouds, casting a bright light over the neighborhood. I looked up at the flag, reached out, and straightened the slightly frayed edge. The lien was gone. But the real fight for Oak Ridge Estates was just beginning. Cold rain slicked the asphalt of the Oak Ridge Plaza parking lot on the morning the eviction became absolute. Sheriff's Deputy Miller parked his cruiser near the curb, his headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. Beside him was a panel van belonging to a local commercial locksmith. I stood under the overhang holding a thermal thermos of black coffee and a manila folder containing a judge's rubber-stamped order of possession. At exactly 7:45 a.m., Blanca Young's white Lexus pulled into her usual reserved spot. She stepped out, clutching a designer umbrella, her face a mask of irritated disbelief. She had received the certified eviction notice. She had received the default judgment when the HOA's lawyer, David Caldwell, officially dropped them as a client due to unpaid retainers. But Blanca operated in a reality where the rules only applied to other people. She genuinely believed her title of HOA president granted her diplomatic immunity from commercial property law. "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Martin?" she demanded, marching up to the glass door of Suite 104. She pointedly ignored the deputy and the man holding a heavy-duty Makita drill. "I have a board meeting to prepare for." "Not in this building, you don't," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "The lease was terminated for non-payment of commercial penalties. The grace period expired at midnight. As of right now, the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association is trespassing on private property. Blanca scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. She reached for the door handle. Deputy Miller stepped forward, resting a hand casually on his duty belt. "Ma'am, I wouldn't do that. Mr. Martin has a valid writ of possession. You are legally locked out. If you attempt to force entry, I will have to arrest you for trespassing." Blanca froze. The umbrella trembled slightly in her grip. She looked at the deputy's badge, then at the locksmith, and finally at me. For the first time since I moved into Oak Ridge, the bureaucratic armor cracked. Raw, unadulterated panic flashed in her eyes. "All of our records are in there," she stammered, her voice losing its commanding edge. "The financial ledgers, the architectural blueprints, the resident dispute files. You can't just seize the nonprofit's operational assets. Actually, Section 24 of your lease clearly states that abandoned property or assets left on the premises after a legal lockout forfeit to the landlord to cover outstanding debts," I recited, matching the exact clinical cadence she used when she fined me for my flag bracket. "You owe $14,000 in fines, plus administrative late fees. Those filing cabinets belong to me now." I nodded to the locksmith. He stepped up to the glass door, leveled his drill, and pulled the trigger. The high-pitched whine of metal biting into metal echoed across the empty strip mall. It was an ugly, abrasive sound, but to me, it sounded like 20 years of suburban tyranny finally grinding to a halt. The deadbolt gave way with a sharp crack. The locksmith pulled the cylinder, replaced it with a new one, and handed me a pair of silver keys. "You have 5 minutes to collect any personal items from your desk, Blanca," I said, pulling the door open. "Deputy Miller will escort you." She didn't argue. The fight had completely drained out of her. She walked into the dim office, grabbed a cardboard box from the supply closet, and began tossing things inside. A framed photo of her cat, a brass letter opener, a stack of personalized stationery. She looked small, stripped of the desk and the title that had made her a giant in her own mind. When she walked back out, she didn't look at me. She got into her Lexus and drove away, the tail lights bleeding red into the morning rain. I locked the new deadbolt. Then I went to my truck and pulled out 2 things, a staple gun and a stack of 300 neon yellow flyers. The fortress had fallen, but the treasury was still intact inside those beige metal filing cabinets. It was time to show the kingdom exactly what their taxes had been paying for. That night, I walked the entirety of Oak Ridge Estates. I didn't care about the rain or the cold. I walked up to every single oatmeal-colored house, past the perfectly measured grass and the compliant mailboxes, and I stapled a flyer to every single community bulletin board, taped them to the cluster mailboxes, and left them under windshield wipers. The flyer was simple. "The HOA management office has been legally evicted for financial gross negligence. Your board has bankrupted your community. Want to see where your monthly dues actually went? Town hall meeting, Thursday, 7 p.m. Oak Ridge Plaza, Suite 105, next to the old office." The books are wide open. I didn't sleep much over the next 2 days. I sat on a folding chair inside the cold, fluorescent-lit confines of Suite 104, digging through the HOA's archives. I am not an accountant, but I know how to read a supply manifest, and what I found in Blanca's neatly organized folders was a staggering chronicle of petty corruption and weaponized bureaucracy. She hadn't just been fining people, she had been targeting them. I found a file on a single mother 3 streets over who had been fined nearly $2,000 for having a plastic children's tricycle visible in her side yard. I found documents showing that a retired widow was forced to pay the HOA's preferred landscaping company, owned by Blanca's brother-in-law, exorbitant rates to remove unauthorized rose bushes. I found the legal billing invoices. Over the past 4 years, Blanca had spent $45,000 of neighborhood reserve funds on lawyers to fight residents over minor infractions. She was burning the village to save the zoning laws. Thursday evening brought a bitter, biting wind. I unlocked the vacant storefront of Suite 105. It was a raw, concrete shell of a room that smelled faintly of old drywall dust and cheap floor wax. I had rented 100 folding chairs and borrowed a digital projector from Thorin Wright. I pointed the projector at the blank, unpainted back wall. By 6:45 p.m., I wondered if anyone would actually show up. Apathy is a powerful narcotic, and these people had been asleep for a long time. At 6:50 p.m., the guy who I always saw measuring his hedges with hand shears walked through the door. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder. He took a seat in the back row. By 7:05 p.m., it was standing room only. Over 200 residents crammed into the cold storefront. The air buzzed with a chaotic mixture of anger, confusion, and desperate curiosity. I saw Greg and Paul, the two board members who had signed my variance, standing awkwardly near the door. They looked like prisoners awaiting a firing squad. I walked to the front of the room, plugging my laptop into the projector. The chatter died down instantly. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto the man they had spent 6 months avoiding. "My name is Alden Martin," I said, my voice carrying easily over the damp concrete room. "I live at 42 Maple Court. A lot of you know me as the guy who refused to take down his flag. Tonight, you're going to know me as the guy who owns the building your HOA just got evicted from." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I hit a button on the laptop, and a massive Excel spreadsheet illuminated the back wall. "You pay $120 a month in association dues," I continued, stepping aside so they could see the numbers. "You were told that money goes to road maintenance, landscaping, and community insurance. It doesn't." I spent the next 40 minutes dismantling the illusion. I didn't use hyperbole. I didn't raise my voice. I just pointed at the screen. I showed them the $45,000 paid to David Caldwell's law firm to enforce aesthetic compliance. I showed them the bloated contracts awarded to relatives of the architectural committee. I showed them the ledger of fines, detailing how the board deliberately targeted vulnerable residents who lacked the resources to fight back legally. I projected the file of the single mother with the tricycle. I projected the widow's landscaping bills. The mood in the room shifted. Fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy outrage. The residents of Oak Ridge Estates realized they hadn't been living in a pristine neighborhood. They had been funding a cartel. Suddenly, the glass door at the front of the shop slammed open. Blanca Young marched in. She was wearing a sharp, navy blue blazer, her hair heavily sprayed into place. She carried a thick binder tucked under her arm. She tried to project authority, but the veneer was thin. "This is an illegal gathering," she shouted, pointing a manicured finger at me. "This is an unsanctioned meeting, and any information presented here is a violation of non-disclosure agreements." The room went dead silent. Blanca walked down the center aisle, expecting the sea of residents to part for her in terror like they always had. They didn't move. The guy with the hand shears stepped directly into her path. He was a small, quiet man, but right now, his jaw was set like granite. "Sit down, Blanca," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the lethal weight of a man who had trimmed his bushes to the millimeter one too many times. "Excuse me?" Blanca gasped, genuinely shocked. "Do you know who I am?" "You're the woman who fined me $400 because my trash can was visible for 2 extra hours on a Tuesday," a woman shouted from the back. "You put a lien on my sister's house over a broken window blind," another man yelled. The dam broke. The collective grievances of 100 beaten-down suburbanites flooded the room. They weren't just angry at Blanca. They were angry at themselves for letting it happen. They had traded their peace of mind for the illusion of property value, and now they saw the receipt. "Order!" Blanca screamed, trying to be heard over the rising tide of voices. She looked around frantically for her usual enforcers, but Greg and Paul had quietly slipped out the back door 10 minutes ago. She was entirely alone. I tapped a pen against the microphone. The sharp crack cut through the noise. The room quieted down, turning back to me. "The bylaws of Oak Ridge Estates are terrible," I said calmly. "But they do have one useful clause. Section 8, Paragraph 3. A special election and immediate recall of the entire board of directors can be initiated by a 2/3 majority vote of the homeowners present at any community gathering." I looked directly at Blanca. Her face was ashen. The binder slipped from her grip, hitting the concrete floor with a dull thud. "I am not a board member," I said to the crowd. "I don't want to be. I just wanted to fly my flag in peace. So I'm putting the question to the floor, who wants a new board?" Every single hand in the room went up. It wasn't even a vote. It was an execution. Within 20 minutes, a provisional board was elected from the crowd. They immediately voted to freeze all HOA bank accounts, terminate the Architectural Review Committee, and initiate an independent forensic audit of the past 5 years of ledgers. Blanca didn't stay to watch the end. She picked up her binder and walked out the door, her shoulders slumped, disappearing into the dark parking lot. She moved out of Oak Ridge Estates 3 months later. I heard she downsized to a condo in the city, somewhere with a property management company that wouldn't let her anywhere near a committee. I never sold the strip mall. Thornwright practically begged me to flip it to a developer, but I kept it. I leased Suite 104 to a veteran-owned physical therapy clinic. I leased the storefront next door to a small, independent bakery. It doesn't generate a massive profit, but it pays its own mortgage and keeps my pension intact. Oak Ridge Estates didn't become a wild, lawless utopia. People still cut their grass. Houses are still mostly oatmeal-colored. We didn't suddenly start painting doors neon green or putting up inflatable snowmen in July. But the neighborhood changed. The crushing, sterile silence was gone. Kids leave their bikes in the driveways now. You can hear wind chimes on Maple Court. People talk to each other over the fences instead of reporting each other to a hotline. The new HOA board meets once a quarter in a rented room at the public library, and they only enforce rules that actually matter, like structural hazards and noise complaints. I still live at the end of the cul-de-sac. My porch pillar still holds a simple wooden bracket. Every morning, I step outside with my coffee, look down the street, and watch the faded nylon fabric shift in the breeze. It cost me every dime of my savings, a commercial mortgage, and 6 months of war to keep it there. It was worth every single penny. If you want to see how this bureaucratic war ends and what happens when Blanca faces the real cost of her petty tyranny, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who's ever had to deal with a nightmare HOA. Trust me, you don't want to miss part 2 where the eviction notices fly and the neighborhood finally wakes up. Drop a comment below if you think the HOA got exactly what they deserved.